but also to see the vast difference in wealth and privilege between the most developed economies like Singapore versus the least developed places like Paksay in Laos, a hill tribe, where they didn't have proper running water or electricity and would have most of the children die through poor water and malnutrition, not malnutrition, but through diarrhea predominantly and poor water quality. Yeah, that sort of overlies to the starkness of things in the haves and have-nots globally, because you really saw them when we went back to the UK, you saw coming from that environment, how much consumerism focus on the latest expensive handbag or shoes or watches versus the realities on the ground of what really mattered. In these cases, kids playing with a tire and a stick and being perfectly happy. Kids in the West or developed economies having everything but being unhappy.
Where lust for a whole life and nothing but less makes people jump out of a comfortable pond into an unknown ocean. Welcome to that journey between the East and the West. Who says Rolling Stones don't gather moss? Hello everyone, I am Meenu Gupta, your host for the day, and I'm delighted to have you join me every week as amazing people share their incredible and inspiring life stories of straddling continents. Thank you. What gets measured gets done, Peter Drucker famously said. Now, it's a phrase we hear often, especially in the worlds of business policy and sustainability. But it makes me wonder, is everything that truly matters actually measurable? We can track carbon emissions, calculate economic growth, or set targets for renewable energy. But can we measure sustainability in its fullest sense? The balance between people, planet, and purpose. Can we measure peace? Not just the absence of war, but the presence of trust, cooperation, and empathy. And what about kindness? That quiet force that holds communities together. Today, I want to explore these questions amongst many others with my guest, Steve, to ask whether our obsession with metrics helps us move forward or whether it sometimes blinds us to the deeper, more human side of progress. We're living in a time when the lines between the East and the West, between business and purpose, innovation and empathy, are starting to blur. The challenges we face today, from climate crisis to social inequality, demand something deeper than growth. They call for connection, collaboration, and courage. And that's where today's conversation begins. My guest, Steve Melhuish, has spent his life building bridges between people, ideas, and continents. A serial entrepreneur and impact investor, Steve led Property Guru from a startup to an NYSE-listed unicorn before dedicating the last 7 years to tackling the climate crisis and driving inclusive change. He co-founded Wavemaker Impact, Southeast Asia's first climate tech venture builder, with the ambition of reducing 10% of global emissions by 2050. Through his family office, Planet Rise, he supports more than 25 ventures and NGOs, reimagining the relationship between business, society, and the planet. Or that's how I see that. From Europe to Asia, Steve's journey reflects the spirit of our times, that progress is not just about scale, but about purpose, equity, and peace. He's also a recognized Earthshot Prize nominator, advocating for gender inequality, and a mentor for the next generation of climate innovators. Steve, a very warm welcome from my side, and thank you for joining me today, despite the hiccups that can happen between the East and the West, time and many others, and technology. It's wonderful to have you with us in the space where ideas, values, and worlds meet. So
I mean,
before we dive really deep and surface slowly, what do you think about the current obsession with metrics? Does it sometimes blind us to the deeper, more human side of progress? Just a question. It occurred to me.
it was a very interesting start to the conversation. Something I've never put much thought, to be honest, because we are so obsessed with metrics and measure absolutely, or try to measure absolutely everything. And as you said, what gets measured gets done. I guess that's the way in which we've always approached things. But it maybe doesn't bring into play the more softer side of humans and our interactions with other humans and nature and the environment. How do you really measure happiness? I know Bhutan tries, but can you put a number on happiness? Can you put a number on compassion? Can you put a number on love and support? And yeah, I'm not sure. It's an interesting question. But how else would you think about the world moving forward, improving, if you don't have some measure, even if it's just intuitive?
Perfect. No, I know where this is, because I think some of those words that you mentioned are actually those soft words which cannot be measured. And we, of course, as human beings, we the inner and the outer, we definitely, the outer progress is also necessary, and that is measurable. So we try to scale that. I will come back to this point towards the later part of our conversation, and we try to find the connect there.
I look forward to that.
And now the deep dive. Don't be surprised. Who
Okay.
are you beyond the labels I read out about you just now?
I'm a father. I'm a husband. I think of myself a little bit as a global citizen. I think of myself as someone who is generous, compassionate, and thinks about this and how we do things in a more compassionate and generous way.
Good. That sets the ground for the later part of our conversation. Steve, you've built and scaled companies across continents, and then you made a very deliberate shift from pure entrepreneurship to impact and climate action. Now, was there a particular moment or experience that made you stop and think, I need to build differently now?
Yeah, a big factor, or the main factor in the last, I guess, 12 or 13 years of my life have been shaped by my kids. My kids came along as twins after a long journey. And so I'm an old father. Having twins 13 years ago or so was the main reason for taking a step back from the business I was running at that stage. And I became a father, but I was a founder. And being a founder the way I was being a founder and running a business which is across 5 countries and 1,300 staff and scaling rapidly was not consistent with being a father. And I woke up one day and wasn't around for my kids for the first 3 years of their life. And that was a bit of a wake-up call. And that, for me, was not sustainable if I wanted to be a father and be there for my kids, because it was not possible to rewind the time once it had gone. And so that was a big wake-up call. And that ultimately led to me taking a step back from the company I built, Property Guru, and gradually handed over and took a step back and hired a CEO in 2018. And in 2018, the climate drum was beating very, very loudly. And that then led me on this journey of discovery of what's happening in the world from a climate point of view. My kids also woke me up to this whole gender gap that exists. And whilst I always thought I was very tuned into it, having a boy and a girl twin suddenly made it very stark in terms of how gender stereotyping works from day zero. And so I saw how the grandparents, what they bought for kids, both shops, toys, pink and blue, or action figures versus dolls, animals on one side, and picking up books with pilots who are men, the stewardess is a stewardess, the doctor is a man, the nurse is a woman, and the person in the kitchen is a woman. And this whole stereotyping in gender, I thought I was tuned into, but clearly I wasn't. So again, my kids woke me up not only just to the future generation, how important they are to me, but also gender and also then climate. So they have a lot to answer for in a very positive way of really shining a light and amplifying the areas which are now the most important areas for me professionally and personally, and where I devote my attention. So yeah, they have a lot to answer for, but also I thank them for that as well.
That's interesting. I'm also a late mother, Steve, and I would have a kid similar. And I think probably having been there, we bring a different way of being to being parents then, more observation. And exactly the same thing about gender I also noticed when my son wore Leela boots when he was 5 years old, Leela gumboots to school. And then he came back very happily, he chose the color, and then came back next day, I will never wear these boots again because they were Leela.
Right.
And that is what, unfortunately, that happens everywhere. And I think, as you rightly said, it begins there. So we need to rethink how we are projecting. So I'm there with you.
Yeah, I think we've come a long way in many regards, but we still have a long way to go.
How did you end up in Asia in the first place? Were you born and brought up in the west part of the world?
I was born in the UK. My father is British. My mother was German. And that sort of always brought this interesting, maybe for listeners who are in Europe or have appreciation Europe, Britain versus Europe, slight differences of views. But my mother brought me up very much as a European and embracing all the good things that this collective group of fragmented nations and the rich diversity of culture brought. And so my father was in the army, so we moved around every 2 years. And so I never really had a home where I grew up. And so I was moving, not anywhere particularly exciting, but between the UK and Germany in different locations every 2 years, and having to join new schools every 2 years, having to make friends every 2 years. And I'm sure deep down that's had some psychological impact on long-term relationships and how I think about those sort of things. But also taught me to adapt, to constantly adapt to new situations, new environments. So that was my early background. And then later on in life, I had this itch to travel. And so the businesses I was building initially in a corporate environment were global and regional, which enabled me to travel and meet other cultures and work and do other business in different countries. And then the Asia connection happened really as a result of that extension of that, deciding to take a break earlier in my career to travel around Southeast Asia for 6 months with my girlfriend, who became my wife. And it was a very exciting and inspiring, but also very humbling process to first of all have the freedom to go and explore any country, any village, any city in Southeast Asia is what we did for those 6 months. But also to see the vast difference in wealth and privilege between the most developed economies like Singapore versus the least developed places like Paksay in Laos, a hill tribe where they didn't have proper running water or electricity and would have most of the children die through poor water and malnutrition, not malnutrition, but through diarrhea predominantly and poor water quality. Yeah, and that sort of overlies to the starkness of things in the haves and have-nots globally, because you really saw them when you went back to the UK, you saw coming from that environment, how much consumerism focus on the latest expensive handbag or shoes or watches versus the realities on the ground of what really mattered in these cases. Kids playing with a tire and a stick and being perfectly happy. Kids in the West or developed economies having everything but being unhappy. And some interesting contrasts on that journey. But that ultimately led to me to say, actually, whilst I had been building businesses in a corporate and had already started my first startup, what I wanted to do was build something in Asia, because I saw the opportunity there as countries were developing and the rise of digital internet was starting pre-smartphone. And so, yeah, so that kind of led me to explore opportunities initially in China. And then my wife's company had a reorganization and offered a role in Singapore. And we ended up in Singapore by accident and then spent almost 2 decades there. So, yeah, it's a bit, you go on a journey sometimes and you might not hit directly north, but you can come close to it.
Yep. Sometimes it's destined. So where do you belong now? Where do you feel you belong?
Well, that's a very good question. I think, yeah, I always regarded myself as a European in Asia. And I guess I still do, really. I have subsequently moved to the UK because we're closer to the two remaining parents on both our sides. But pretty much everything I do from a professional point of view is still very much rooted in Asia. And so I still have very strong ties between the East and the West. And whilst I might be sitting here every day, I'm doing something with companies or investors or other founders and entrepreneurs in the East, predominantly in Southeast Asia, emerging markets, Southeast Asia. So yeah, so it's a tough question to answer. I guess I've always been a bit of a nomad, but I think there's definitely a strong connection into Asia, sense of identity with Asia, the consensus-based approach, more community-based approach that resonates well with me. Can be frustrating sometimes, but also resonates well with me. So yeah, so I feel like I struggle now, Europe and Asia, with my heart still in Asia.
Yeah. Okay, you're a European based in Asia and both ways. Actually, you make a perfect guest because of your East-West connections and your mindset, which is open. If you're not open, you're not able to appreciate the other side. So what I see is that you observe. Observation without judgment is where everything begins, actually. Having said that, I gather then home is somewhere in between.
Yes. Home at the moment is where we're living, which is in the UK. But as I said, there's still that strong connect. My kids were born in Singapore. They spent 90% of their life in Singapore. They still have very strong anchor and memories and desires for things that they miss from living in Southeast Asia. And so, yeah, they are very much the culture kids. And so they obviously struggle to initially integrate into a brand new culture for them, even though their parents both carry British passports. They obviously had strong, deep roots and still do in Singapore.
Understandable. They are, as you rightly said, they are third culture kids. And that brings along a completely different way of being and adaptation. But my son is also a third culture kid. So, and what I really understood over time and what other lot of people have said, their resilience is stronger because they have to open and adapt at an earlier age. So their openness and their resilience and the innovation is at a different level altogether. And their acceptance is also different. We have a place where I think my son was exposed to that many nationalities pouring into our house with babysitters from different nationalities. And so it was very normal. Somebody's culture, somebody talks like this, somebody comes from another place. So for him, color, culture, religion, everything is gone out of the window.
Exactly. I can relate to that completely. I mean, my kids' best friends were Japanese or Chinese, Indian, Filipinos, French, all nationalities. And so that was normal for them.
It's lovely because it makes them global citizens from an earlier age rather than putting them in a certain... It has its challenges, but more pros than cons. Now, you've lived and worked in both Europe and Asia, two regions with very different business cultures and social realities, some of which you mentioned. How have these worlds shaped your approach to solving the climate crisis, and what can the East and West learn from each other when it comes to creating sustainable and inclusive innovation?
I think there's a few questions in there.
Yes, I was just going to say I should have broken it in two parts. I got very ambitious.
I'll see if I can remember the various parts. Well, I think one reflection I've personally been having recently is I've always talked about East versus West. I've talked about Europe versus Asia, or not versus, but the two different geographies and continents. And obviously they combine whole mishmash of cultures, languages within those continents. But at least in the context of the work that I've been doing, it's become a bit more nuanced, I think. And it's a bit more around developed economy versus maybe emerging economy. So in many cases, I guess, in the context of climate change, the global north, the developed economies of the global north have produced emissions, and the global south, and particularly emerging countries in the global south, are on the receiving end, the most vulnerable to climate change and suffering the most from climate change. Has been one reflection. But also just the way in which these countries can see and adapt and respond to climate change, and innovation in that space is also very different. So if I talk to my peers and people in the industry who think about sort of climate technologies and climate tech in Europe and the US, it's very much with a lens of new technology. It's research-based, it's rocket science, it's technologies which are going to revolutionize and transform and create brand new industries in their own kind, hopefully in the next maybe 3 or 4 decades. And that's born out of, I think, in the case of Europe, strong regulatory environment, consumers. I said I grew up in Germany, and I remember, well, it's 50 years ago, I guess, almost now, where as a kid I'd go to the bottle banks with my parents. We'd put the green bottles in the green bottle bank, and the brown bottles in the brown bottle, and clear ones. And so that recycling mentality and a little bit of thinking about recycling being there inherently for the last 50 years or so in many of the countries in Europe. And in the US, it's still the home of capital and cash, and has driven a lot of the innovation, rocket science innovation that's underway and still going on. But then if I look at emerging markets, at least in Asia, and I suspect also in Africa and LATAM, we maybe don't have that pressure yet to think about climate technology and adopting this climate technology. These countries are going from developing emerging markets to developed and trying to. And so there's large-scale urbanization taking place, large-scale economic development taking place, infrastructure investment taking place. And that's leading to, obviously, emissions growing, but then people getting their first home, their first 2-wheel, 3-wheel, 4-wheel, fridge, phone, TV, etc., which, of course, is driving emissions. And so the focus is very much around, well, how do I get my first house? How do I earn enough income to get my kids educated? How do I make sure that my kids are getting the healthcare they need? And drivers, the priorities are very, very different from maybe what we see in developed economies or Europe and the West and the global North. And so then in that, how do we think about climate and climate technologies and this kind of thing? So the way in which we've approached it has been very much, first and foremost, how do we make the lives better for the individuals? And so whether it's a consumer in the Philippines or it's a rice farmer in Indonesia or a factory in Vietnam, how do we help them earn a little bit more money? How do we help them, how does a rice farmer earn, instead of $100 a month, $120 a month, rather than borrowing lots of money before the harvest season happens, where they can generate some income? How do they then eke out a living in between? And so we're very much approaching it from that perspective and trying to think about how we can deliver a cleaner and a cheaper technology for them. And so that's essentially what we've been doing with the Venture Build Fund, which is looking for these opportunities where we can deliver essentially a green discount, where the end user benefits, in most cases economically, by generating more yield for the farmer or lower costs for the factory or whatever it might be like that. So because the regulatory pressures maybe not there, this innovation maybe is that the priority is a little bit different. So we're just approaching it from a very simple way. And we have all the technology we need already today to reduce emissions by 50%. So it's not so much about reinventing new things, it's about deployment of what we already have and faster, which means in some cases, people are leaping technology. So rather than getting your first combustion engine car, you maybe then getting your first vehicle is actually an electric vehicle, rather than buying your first irrigation pump powered by diesel, is actually powered by solar. And so you'll see this technology skipping taking place, where you don't have a transition from one legacy technology to the latest one. There's opportunities in emerging markets to leapfrog. And we saw this a little bit with digital in places like Africa, with digital wallets in Kenya, for example, where suddenly that became the norm. And I think we see the same now taking place in this green transition, in emerging markets in Asia, for example.
That's a lot. And I'm going to, from what you said, 3 takeaways. I love that line because that makes for a justifiable move on. And that's real progress in my head. How do we make lives better?
Yeah, absolutely.
That is a perfect, I would call it wholesome entrepreneurship for the right reasons. And yes, you're right, the challenges in different parts of the globe would be very different. And the innovation which can make life better there in that part of the world would be a very simple one, where here, as you rightly said, one's looking at rocket science, which is at a different level and non-touchable in the sense you don't relate to it in an everyday way when and while it is happening.
Correct.
And
you're worried about feeding your family of 5
exactly
next month. Yeah.
And it all boils down to, I've been reflecting a lot, Steve, in the last couple of years, also defined my journey, shaping consumer choices. That shapes a lot of what is happening on the planet. When one shapes the consumer choices, it forces the producers to move in a certain way, even when they don't want to look at it. They want to behave like an ostrich, which can happen, profit before people, or profit before whatever. But they forget to see sometimes profit can be married to sustainability, which I'm sure you know that. I read that. But yes, I have figured that if you shape consumer choices, which where all the half of the elements begin, it would change a lot. Simple choices. So, and as you mentioned, the leap from the first car being that to that. So that's a lot. That's actually very serious from where we are going.
Yeah. I mean, in many cases, this is just also about even just access. So, for example, one of the businesses which we built is a solar irrigation company, which supports horticultural farmers, of which there's 18 million using diesel water pumps. So why aren't they spending 25, 50% of their income on diesel fuel when they can have free energy from the sun? And a lot of the time it's just access. No one has gone out and spoken to them about what they're doing and provided them with a solution. What this company, Agros, does, for example, is actually that. Provides the access, which is then access plus deliver more income for the farmer, which ultimately means better for the communities, better for the families, better for healthcare, better for education, lifts up the emerging rural populations in many cases.
I totally agree, because actually awareness of it and then access, because one without the other would not work. And a lot of times they're not aware. And a lot of times, as you rightly said, the access, the convenience, the price of it could be for bringing it out to a level where there is access and it is at a price where in those countries it can be used. One has that choice at least. Now,
absolutely. I think just to add, I just triggered a thought. You talked a little bit about that word just, and that's one of the terms you hear a lot in my sector, in terms of climate sector, the sort of just transition. And it's very much used in some cases, as a tool to maybe delay transition to maybe green or cleaner technology, because there is concern that there needs to be a just transition, because otherwise the communities will be impacted by this move and people will lose their jobs or whatever. And you see that very much when it comes to like large-scale coal-fired power plants, for example, and retiring these coal-fired power plants in the region in Southeast Asia, for example. But in reality, you see what some of these businesses that we've been building and working with, they're creating a just transition because they're enabling the green, but they're also improving the lives. And so I think just transition can actually happen today. So rather than be delayed because we're not ready.
I would actually, yes, just transition is something very big, and I'm going to come back to it because that is one of the things which is on my mind to talk to you. Who better than you? Tackle your brains. And now I'm going to give you a tough one, very easy one, but a tough one for somebody else. You're an advocate for gender equality and inclusive leadership. Recently, I had a guest who went on record, went on air, and people loved it, to say that women entrepreneurs are better than their male counterparts. And he gave because he'd been through the whole process. He'd viewed and been there, experienced. what do you think? Some people might kill you for this and some would love you. But yes, what do you think? And that, dear listeners, is the first part of a very rich conversation with Steve. Do tune in to the second part, not only to listen to his reply on women entrepreneurs, but also to gather some amazing insights on how entrepreneurs can remain authentic to their purpose, the usefulness of COP and how climate and peace building are intertwined, and the evolving meaning of success for Steve. Living between the East and the West, Steve has truly gathered enough moss to share some. Thank you for listening to the series Between the East and the West. Do subscribe to the channels mentioned on the site in case, of course, you liked what you heard. I am Meenu Gupta, the host of the series, and I'll be looking forward to your comments. We love feedback. Thank you once again. Namaste and bye-bye.